Hi guys, and welcome to Offgrid and Connected, a podcast about off-grid humanitarianism, building and community. Today's conversation is with Dan Schmidt, a good friend of mine who's quietly going about the business of learning permaculture and sustainable building. He spends his time working on farms, travelling and building, and often mixes all three. In this conversation we talk about farming, the challenges of working in Sierra Leone, working with nature in different environments, and more. I'm sure that this won't be the last interview that Dan does. He has loads of knowledge to share, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thanks for listening, and here's Dan. Dan, so thank you for coming on. I'm looking forward to this conversation about sustainable food, maybe even regenerative food. I know that you've got a keen interest in building as well. That's where we met. But what do you answer people when they ask you, so what do you do?
You know, that's an interesting question. So my simple answer to some will just be farming. I'll tell people, I'm a farmer. I grow food. But then sometimes that leads into them asking questions of, well, you know, what do you grow? How do you grow it? So, I mean, in a nutshell, I do say I'm a sustainable farmer, and I work in building sustainable ecologies or communities surrounding food. The simplest way I can answer that question, I guess.
Would you say that the image of farming is changing, though? Because as a kid, you have this idea of someone with a whole bunch of hay bales somewhere and, you know, an older man. But it seems to me that the farmers I meet now are all cutting edge and doing really exciting experiments with what is absolutely crucial to our existence, food.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a bit of a revolution going on surrounding farming right now, especially with kind of how you're saying the types of farmers that you meet. I mean, definitely when people typically think of farmers, they think of older generations sitting on a tractor, you know, plowing huge corn or soybean fields or something like that. But what's actually happening now is you have these older generation farmers, you know, that their land has been passed down through generation and through families. And this day and age, it's funny. You have both sides. You have people that are in the younger generations that aren't wanting to take over their family farms, which is then opening up opportunities for people that are of the younger generation that are interested in farming, that are kind of the next wave of new farmers that are bringing in these new technologies, new practices. And that's where this idea of, you know, that kind of revolutionary farmer, that new age farmer that you're kind of talking about is happening. So I think the demographic is definitely changing to where you're having much younger farmers coming in with new and fresh ideas.
Yeah, I mean, Nick Rosen's book, Off the Grid, I remember reading that, and one thing that stuck with me was the idea of lots of old people being alone on lots of land. And the possibility to invite younger people to provide company, essentially, while using the land which was just sitting there. And that seems to be like a really interesting development. Is that something you know any stories of or you've heard about?
I mean, I definitely have heard multiple friends of mine that got into farming because, you know, they grew up in a rural community. They themselves maybe weren't farmers. But as they got older and started learning more, they got interested in it, and they had a neighbor who was an older generation farmer that was now, you know, retiring, saying, I'm done farming. But, you know, these older generation farmers, I definitely think still want to have stewards of the land. And so I think that's where they then approach these younger farmers that are and saying, hey, the land is there. You can use it how you see fit. Obviously, you know, I'll give my input and I want to hear what it is that you have as a vision. But yeah, I definitely feel like these older farmers are very open to people coming in with a fresh outlook. Beyond having company, I think it's more so they just want to see the land that they put so much into be then taken care of and transition into something else.
Let's go back a little bit towards what started you off? You know, what your vision was. Is it something you wanted to do as a kid, or did something happen that made you think, I'm going to try this?
Yeah, definitely farming was not on my radar while I was a kid and growing up. Yeah, I mean, I was, to make a long story short, I was in college and studying. I was studying kinesiology or exercise science. I was also playing baseball, and I was just kind of getting burnt out with that. I was getting bored in school and was finding, you know, my classes, I don't want to say like easy, but I was just, I didn't have that excitement about learning that I used to have. And there was a spark that kind of happened in conversations that I was having with some people surrounding, I guess it was kind of more politics and economics and, you know, issues that the United States is facing with wealth distribution and this and that. And all of a sudden that just sent me down this path of looking into, you know, different ways to structure society, different ways to live your life. And it was kind of this push of, I knew I wanted to go into different realms of learning and experiencing rather than the traditional kind of university route. And travel was a big thing on my mind, and I stumbled upon WWOOFing, which worldwide opportunities on organic farms. Yeah, just the database of work trade on farms. And I was like, oh, you know, I can learn and work and get to travel at the same time. And so, and starting out, that was, you know, the main draw for me. But then from there, I discovered through self-research just what permaculture was and stumbled upon that term, and then started diving into that and learning about different, you know, concepts surrounding the issues we're facing with topsoil erosion and depletion of biodiversity within our crops and what chemicals are actually going into our food. And all of a sudden I felt like I was just getting hit with all of this new information, and and I just kind of went for it and ended up dropping out of school and landed an internship at an organic vegetable farm in just outside of Madison, Wisconsin. And that was kind of the start for me.
Wow. So what do you think it was that predisposed you to doing this? I mean, you said the passion for finding new solutions for society and the problems that are facing us at the moment. But it sounds like you don't just you also study farming. I mean, you're looking at chemistry, maybe you're looking at different areas of biology. I mean, how would you say the balance between study and doing works in your activities day to day?
I think at the end of the day, doing is really the only way to become a very, I don't want to say very talented farmer, but like it's the only way to really kind of test your knowledge. Because the interesting thing with farming is you can sit here and study different soil types and how plants grow and different nutrient cycles that each plant has and all of this. But until you get on a piece of land and start, you know, working with the different microclimates and starting to see what pests are around and how they interact with your plants and other animals that are around and how they come into play, how just wind and temperature and sunlight and all these things. And it's great to go in with a solid theoretical knowledge, but you really don't start solidifying, I think, your skills as a farmer until you're actually working on your land. And even once you work on one piece of land, you'll jump to another one, and it's a whole different scenario. And me personally, that's what I love about farming, is that it's constantly challenging you, and it's constantly making you kind of adapt and hone your skills even more. Because to sit here and go from one place to another, you got to be quick on your feet, and you have to have that base of that theoretical knowledge. But until you start getting down and in the dirt, that's when it really happens.
It's a question I often think about. I mean, I love plants and I love seeing plants thrive, but until recently, my attempts at gardening, I think, would be most kindly described as distracted. So I think you need presence. You need to be there regularly. You can't miss out on watering. You can't miss out on clearing space if things are getting too cramped.
Mm-hmm.
Or I noticed my daughter has a way with plants, and it brings to mind the expression to have a green thumb. How would you define having a green thumb? I mean, what is that? Do you see some people with it, some people without it? Is it something you develop?
I think it's definitely something that some people naturally have, but on the flip side, it is something that people can develop. Because some people may spend most of their life never really working with plants, and then they may start and kind of fall in love with it and not be necessarily very talented right away or have what you would consider a green thumb, but then as they get more and more, their green thumb kind of develops. I think where it starts is just having a sense of responsibility towards land and understanding that that's where you come from, that's where you get your sustenance, that's where you get your food, your water, and all of those things. And so I think it's the people that have a green thumb naturally to them also have a love for nature and an understanding that they need to take care of that nature, I think is kind of where that almost comes from.
Are there some plants, for instance, that you understand more? Are there others that you understand less? Like, is there an area that you find yourself attracted to?
Overall, I'm starting to become more attracted to trees. Whether that be fruit-bearing trees or nitrogen-fixing trees or trees that are used as shade crops or timber crops, mainly because, well, I guess to go even broader beyond trees are just perennial plants in general is kind of what I'm becoming more attracted to, and perennial being a type of plant that you plant once and it stays, for some are short-term, 3 to 5 years, some are 10 plus years or 20 plus. So they're plants that, you plant once and you take care of, but the intensiveness of the care that goes into it is a lot less than, say, an annual like vegetable. And what draws me to that is the fact that perennial plants help with retaining moisture in the soil. They help build topsoil. They reduce the amount of topsoil erosion that happens. So I'm starting to see myself gravitate more towards that realm, whereas when I first started farming, it was a lot of, intensive annual vegetable production. Even with annuals and perennials, each plant is going to have its own characteristics. Each one is going to need its own care. In general, perennials typically need to be watered less, whereas annuals you need to worry about, watering every day. But something that I like to view or think about while I'm growing and working with different plants is viewing them honestly as your children. And you being a parent might be able to relate to this, especially those that have multiple kids. Each kid is going to have their own characteristics, and your style of parenting might change with those. And it's honestly the same with plants. And I tell people that my plants and the trees that I've planted and this and that they're like my children, and you kind of come to understand the different tendencies that each one has. This one doesn't like too much sunlight, but this one likes a lot of sunlight, or this one wants a little bit of water, or this one wants a lot of water. So that's where it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, where, you can read about all of these things and try to study and go, but until you start working with them and growing with them, that's when you kind of start to, realize these tendencies that the plants have.
Wow, I totally hear you. I mean, what you were saying before though about switching from vegetables and annual plants to perennials, that makes me think of two things. I'll take them one at a time. One is the role that perennials are having in, the idea of the practice of reforestation, and how there's an example of a Dutchman in Indonesia. I need to get his name, but he replanted so many trees that he brought back rain to an area that had lost it. And that's something that I would love to see more projects about, replanting and turning bad soil, but acres of it back into good soil through, I think what he did was he had like something incredible, hundreds of different types of plants, and he had an order. He experimented with the order in which he'd had to plant them. So, when he was on destroyed soil, he'd put one plant in, and that would just root the soil a little bit and provide a little bit of shade for another plant to start to grow, and each would feed it. And he had these, is that something you know about, or is something you could see yourself getting into as a project?
I definitely have heard quite a lot about those types of projects and very interested in them. And yeah, and like what you're saying is that's, perennial, especially tree crops, they provide that opportunity to reclaim destroyed lands. And kind of what you're saying about this Dutch guy is you have to understand the cycle of when to plant those. And I know specific projects that I can think of right now is maybe not necessarily degraded. Well, yeah, in its own way, degraded land. But in the Midwest, you have a lot of, obviously, corn and soybean production. And doing that for generation after generation, strips the land after time. You're constantly taking the same nutrients out of the soil. You're constantly ripping up your topsoil, which over time actually depletes the amount of organic matter that you have in your soil. And when you start taking the life away from soil, that's when you start altering kind of natural cycles, or almost like the nitrogen cycle, which, plays into your climate with how much rain you end up getting and, how much moisture is held on your land. And so in the Midwest, where you have these lands that topsoil has, basically eroded away, areas are becoming dry and barren, people are coming in and doing various styles of reforestation. One that comes to mind are different agroforestry concepts. And there are various styles of agroforestry. Whether you have alley cropping, you have silvopasture, you have, your typical, when people think permaculture, your food forest on like a smaller scale, which is very intensive. But all of these practices are basically taking land that's been stripped and trying to turn it back into a forest. Because when you go out into nature, the healthiest ecosystem that you typically see is a forest. You have, varying areas with, shade and sunlight, lots of different animal species. You have leaf litter and plant material that's falling onto the forest floor and keeping it more moist and creating an environment for microorganisms and other insects and this and that to thrive. So all of these different agroforestry practices are, in a sense, reforestation and trying to take degraded land and turning it back into, a healthier kind of ecosystem.
Wow.
I don't know if that kind of, no, I feel like I kind of went off in another direction.
No, but. I mean, I'm having to rein myself in because I've got so many questions that are coming out of this. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of a podcast I heard, the Joe Rogan podcast. I think it's number 1035 with Paul Stamets. Do you know Paul Stamets, the mushroom expert?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, he was talking about how mushrooms, he blew my mind about 4 times on that podcast. Thoroughly recommend it. But he was talking about how mushrooms also sometimes have this role of clearing small patches of forest, that then become sort of meadows or grassland for a little while and feed animals, and then they go back to being forest. It was absolutely amazing. And you mentioned microorganisms, and it seems to be so much happening in that world. I mean, do you find yourself looking around at everything that's happening at the moment and being drawn to a particular direction, or do you just find it overwhelming? For me, as a beginner, it's just crazy what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I being 4 to 5 years into doing this now, I still get overwhelmed with, the different directions that you can go with sustainable farming. And it's kind of a double-edged sword is, I get all, bummed out and depressed when I start looking at the different challenges we're facing surrounding, food security, access to clean water, and, and housing and this and that. But then on the flip side, the more I research, I go, oh, well, this person's doing this and this person's doing that, and there's this solution and that solution, and all of a sudden I find myself going, well, I want to try this and I want to try that, and it's really inspiring that there are so many different people that are coming up with very creative solutions to the many problems that we're facing, and a lot of these solutions aren't necessarily new concepts. They're things that, our ancestors did for hundreds of years, and they just kind of disappeared for a while. And now we're seeing this, they're starting to come back to the surface, and people are shedding new light on them, maybe putting their own spin on it. So yeah, kind of like you're saying, I get a little overwhelmed at times with, what direction do I necessarily want to go with farming? But I think it's one of those things that, whatever situation you're in or opportunity that arises, you just kind of have to look into finding what system works best for that particular situation.
Let's get maybe a little bit more specific. You've worked in a number of places. Maybe you could take us through what each place set out to do, or say the positive sides of each place and their mission, and a little bit about what you learned.
Yeah, I guess I'll try to keep it brief with each one. Going back to when I had mentioned that there was a farm that I started on doing an internship just outside of Madison, Wisconsin. This was an organic vegetable farm, mainly doing salad mix, baby leaf salad mix production, but as well as, a wide variety of different vegetables for CSA and farmers markets, and wholesale to restaurants and grocery stores. We also raised laying hens, sheep, pigs. What I took away most from that farm was they very much approached farming from a business side in the terms of, hey, we're farmers that want to have good practices and produce high quality, nutritious, clean food for people. But at the end of the day, we also want to have a viable business that can pay ourselves as owners as well as pay employees, which ended up being me as their first actual paid employee. So it was a good experience getting to see that side of farming, because a lot of people that dive into permaculture all of a sudden realize are like, how can I make money doing this? This just doesn't seem possible. So I definitely took away quite a lot from that side with that farm. And then on the flip side, another farm in the Midwest that I spent some time volunteering with was a farm called Versaland in just outside of Iowa City. And they were kind of answering those questions when people were saying, well, how can you, beyond just sustaining yourself, how can you make a business through, sustainable agriculture? And that's where the idea of silvopasture came into play. And that's basically where you have rows and rows of tree crops, whether that be, your very large overstory, say like oak, maple, chestnut, hickory, those types of trees, with your understory fruit trees like apple, pawpaw, pear, plum, those types, and then berry shrubs. And then in the alleyways between, leaving for, grassland or prairie land to maybe graze some animals, or leave to be a natural kind of wildflower forest area, and focusing on increasing biodiversity. And so you had Versaland was a 250 acre property that was planting thousands and thousands of trees. So they definitely we're approaching the side of, okay, here's how you can design a piece of land that is increasing biodiversity, increasing the amount of microbial health you have in your soil through the use of, trees that are naturally mulching your soil, nitrogen fixing trees, those types of things. So that Versaland was really my first experience of seeing a farm that was combining, that business side that I saw from Vitruvian Farms, which was the farm in Wisconsin that I started at, and then combining this permaculture side of things. And we actually ended up taking a lot of the things we saw with Versaland and other things we had learned through other outputs, and then planting our own orchard in Wisconsin at Vitruvian Farms, kind of following those types of practices.
So let me interrupt you 1 second and just go a little bit deeper on this subject of economically sustainable, being able to continue doing what you're doing from an economic perspective. What was the situation there? I mean, did it work? Was it something that is feasible? What are your thoughts on that?
So the lessons I learned with both were, in terms of Versaland, at first it seemed like the owner was just planting trees just because, trees, are going to take 3-5+ years until you're going to get a harvest from them. So he approached it as, I need to get as many trees in the ground as possible, seeing the long-term vision, and seeing, the yields that would come out of them, the potential for market sales and wholesales and value-added products and this and that. So the long-term vision was definitely there, but where there was a bit of a lacking was, okay, how are you initially going to finance all of that? It's great when you go into a project and, you have all of this money to do those things and, kind of sustain yourself until you get to that point where you're bringing in a revenue from your crops. And he was trying to supplement it at Versaland through different, educational workshops and tours and events, and that kind of thing. Whereas with Vitruvian in Wisconsin, with that farm, they kind of went the other route. They knew that their long-term goal was basically what Versaland was doing and already developing. But they knew that they didn't have the funding initially and weren't going to be able to sustain themselves financially if they just went for that right away. So they approached it as, all right, we need to figure out our market that can bring us in income that can allow us to grow slowly to the point that we want to be. And that was where salad mix came in for them. So that's, I think now when I first started working for them, it was maybe they were harvesting and selling 500, 600 pounds of salad mix a week. And I think now they're up to over 1,000 pounds a week. And in that time, they've been able to, start planting more trees, start going in the direction long term of where they want to be. And they were able to do that because of their kind of business model that they surrounded around salad mix. So I guess that was kind of the two big things that I realized was sometimes when you have a long-term vision with farming, it might take you a little while to get there just because, you're not making millions of dollars being a farmer, and you have to figure out ways to bring in money to allow you to get to that point. Now, in the dream world, it's great if you go into a project having your funding already all set up and you can just go for it. But even then, you have to, what's going to sustain it long term. And I find farmers are getting more and more creative, especially kind of with this new wave of farmers and ways to make money. You have people that are doing, like winery tours or vacation and rentals. That's kind of doing the whole agrotourism side of thing. You have different types of workshops and retreats popping up on farms, and these like cob oven pizza nights and music events and value-added products with, whether you're making fruit wines or jellies or jams or breads, or people, doing various types of CSA. So you just kind of have to.
Sorry, CSA. You said that twice now. I need to plead ignorance.
CSA, it stands for Community Supported Agriculture, and it's basically where an individual or a family they buy into a farm in a sense, and they pay, in Hawaii where I've worked, they pay a monthly due, and it gets them a weekly box or bag of produce from the farm that either they come pick up from the farm itself, or there's a pickup point where people will come and meet that the farmer will bring the produce to. In the Midwest, like Wisconsin and Iowa, it's typically people pay for a whole season ahead of time because there's only about a 7-month growing season in that area, and they're kind of taking the risk with the farmer, because that's another thing that's tough with farming, especially if you're doing markets and wholesale to restaurants, is you put a lot of money into buying your seeds, planting your seed, your soil amendments, and this and that, and it's a long time before you get money then back after you sell this produce. So that's the nice thing with the CSA in those temperate climates, is these individuals and families pay the farmer ahead of time, before the season starts, for their, weekly box for a 7-month stretch. So they're kind of taking that risk with the farmer, saying, okay, here's your money to get you started for the season. And, hope, and, both parties, cross their finger and hope for good weather conditions, no hits of, frost or disease or this or that. So that's kind of a way that farms are creating a community type sense with their people that they're selling their produce to. So.
Yeah, that's something I see here as well. I mean, I hope to speak to some more people here as well eventually. As often happens, the States has its own entrepreneurial approach to this and seems to be a little bit ahead of the curve compared to a lot of the rest of the world. But that may be just an impression. So that's 2 places we've looked at, and it's great. I'm loving all the information that's coming out of this. What happened next for you? Where was the next place?
Next place. So there are various places. I won't talk too much about them. I'll just kind of touch a little bit. So while working for Vitruvian farms in Wisconsin, I would get, about 5-6 months off every year because winter would roll around and we weren't growing food. So this is when I would kind of go and travel. That was during the time that, I discovered Earthships and went and spent time in Taos, New Mexico, building there. And so that was kind of my first dive into, the natural building side of things, and, realizing that, okay, if I want to have a farm, I also need structure to live in. And so that was that kind of side. I also worked on farm in Valley Center, California, and then Canby, Oregon. And those were kind of my first 2 introductions to, your homesteading farm. Like, I have my house that I've built, and I'm planting and growing all of my food to sustain my own diet, or my family's diet, and maybe, some surrounding community members. So now that was kind of the point that I now started seeing and being introduced to, there are the various levels of farming that you have. You have, your small scale homesteading style. Then you have, your kind of smaller organic farm that's supplying food to, some restaurants, maybe like a few hundred people. And then you have your bigger, large scale organic farms that are trying to supply a lot of food to a lot of different people. After those first few years at Vitruvian, that was kind of the turning point for me. Was I wanted to start diving into these different realms of farming and starting to explore what exactly could happen. And so that ended up leading to me going to Hawaii. And when I went to Hawaii, it was going to another, small scale organic farm, but it was more so the draw there was going to a different type of environment and working with different crops, completely different kind of ecosystem and weather patterns and all of that, and doing my first experience of year-round farming and no break in terms of having a frost in a winter to kind of reset you here. And that was a challenge at first because I never really appreciated how much a winter actually helped because, if you get a pest or a disease problem, winter comes, it gets killed off, and you get to restart at the season. Whereas in Hawaii, you get that, and it's, you have it all year until you figure out a way to get rid of it.
So take me through a moment where you're sort of strolling along, sundown or something, relaxing, and then you sort of see a black patch on the leaves, or you realize something's not right. What happens then? How do you resolve that problem?
It's first scratching your head and beginning to research and going, okay, what exactly is the problem? Is it a pest that's doing it, or is it a disease? What helped us in Hawaii was, there was a lot of times that we were able to take tissue samples, and we had connections to the UH facilities, and that's the college university that's on the island. And we'd be able to send in tissue samples, and they'd come back and be like, yep, this is what you have. And other times, you just kind of have to look at your plant and then go to the internet and be like, okay, it kind of looks like this disease, or it kind of doesn't. And so it was really nice in those moments. Like a specific example I can think of was growing tomatoes outdoors in Hawaii is very challenging because they're very susceptible to disease hitting them, and whether that's blight or certain nutrient deficiencies as well as pests coming. And we were able to identify the issues that we were having with our outdoor tomatoes we were trying to grow like right away. And from there, it's basically you have to figure out, okay, this disease happens typically because of this nutrient deficiency that's in your soil. And so then you have to explore. So like for blight with tomatoes, it's typically, I think it was like a copper and a zinc deficiency. And so it's then figuring out, okay, how can I supplement that into my soil to help make it better? So that's where it becomes very, very challenging when you're trying to deal with pest and disease issues kind of in that conventional realm. And when I say conventional, that even includes organic practices. And I think that's what's great about the ideas surrounding permaculture is that you're trying to create such a biodiverse environment where all of your plants are growing that your soil health is booming. You have all of those different macro and micronutrients and minerals. When you have that healthy soil environment and that, and that wide range of diversity, it's very hard for pests and disease to then come in because there's just, there's so much difference around everywhere. Whereas, when you have rows and rows of the same crop, a pest can come in and be like, oh, this is beautiful. I can come in, make my home and spread because it's all the same. Whereas if you have very healthy environment with multiple different species that are all healthy, a disease or a pest tries to jump from one place to another, and it can't because all of a sudden it's an entire different environment.
What makes a pest and a crop or a vegetable a vegetable? Why is it that a healthy environment for what we want is healthy and pests don't like that? Whereas, and the opposite is also true, where an unhealthy environment for what we want is good for pests. I mean, what are the light and dark forces here?
You have to look at it at the standpoint of, typically a pest is something that's going to come in and eat your crop to the point where you barely get any harvest from it. Now, I think it's a good practice to approach farming realizing that there's a give and take. There's this, all right, I'm going to grow this much food and I'm going to harvest this much, and I'm just going to accept that this much will get eaten by this animal. And when I say pest, that could be an insect, that can be a bird, a deer, those types of things. Because deers can be devastating in orchards. Same with birds. The environment where we want to where farmers typically want to go when they think of growing food, especially if we go to the older generations in conventional thinking, is they think, all right, I need to maximize this much space and plant as much of this crop as I can so I can make as much of money as possible off of it. Yeah, let's take like an apple tree orchard, for example, and you'd have rows and rows of just, one type of apple, maybe a couple different types of apples. Now, with that, you're creating an area that is the same. You're taking the same nutrients out of the soil over time. You have the same, tree structure, growth patterns within the tree, and this and that. So when, say, a deer comes up and wants to eat some fruit, it's going to just go through and, take whatever it wants. Same with, different worms or insects that might come and cause disease, and why that environment that we think is good for us in terms of growing food and maximizing yields and space, it's actually, it hurts us in the end, because with doing that, it's tough to explain. It's literally when a pest comes, and especially an insect, and it can come and thrive on one of those trees, and that's where it's eating this and that, and all of a sudden it wants to spread and reproduce. It can easily then jump to the tree that's, right next to it, because it's the exact same environment, and it's conducive for it. And whereas, say you have an orchard where you alternate, so like at Vitruvian Farms, with the orchard that we planted, we never had repeating trees next to each other. We followed what we called an alternating trio pattern. So we would plant, one type of nitrogen fixing tree. Then we would plant, say, an apple tree, then a pear tree, then a different species of a nitrogen fixing tree, then, a pawpaw tree, and this and so we were always changing, what type of fruit tree it was, as well as, even the specific variety of that fruit tree, because you have all sorts of different types of varieties of apples and plums and pears and this and that. So that's where the idea, if you hear people talk about, we're losing biodiversity, when you lose biodiversity, you're losing an environment for microorganisms and the things that you need in your soil to thrive.
You're essentially hedging your bets.
Exactly.
Sorry for the pun, but it's sort of spreading what you're hoping for over across.
Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing. There's kind of, in nature, there's this give and take where kind of everyone has a piece of the pie, if that makes sense. Whereas our conventional style of farming, we're approaching it going, no, we want the whole pie. Like and that's just, and now we're starting to realize how much that's biting us, in the butt now.
You sound like you're moving towards a certain direction. I mean, I know you've got many years ahead, but do you find yourself saying, if I have to run an area, or if I have to set up my own project, I would do this, I wouldn't do this. I mean, have you got a checklist that's beginning to form or not?
Yeah, I would say I do. It's somewhat of a broad checklist. I would say, yeah, because, within permaculture, the things that you just mentioned, you have the idea of, growing food and increasing biodiversity and soil health, as well as, being economically sustainable. But then within permaculture, you have the social side. So that's where community comes into play, and different social enterprises, and, ecology. And then you have the natural building side of things, in terms of, renewable energy and alternative methods to construction and what you're going to live in. And then water is a whole nother concept in terms of where your water is coming from and how you're taking care of it and how you're using it. So, those are the things that are always rolling around in my head when I think of different projects that I want to be a part of, or projects that I want to start myself. The other things that I also think about is the situation. And by situation, I mean, is it more of a city and urban environment for this type of project? Is it more of a suburban type project? Is it more rural and broad scale? Is it third world? Is it first world? So all of those things I'm very open and interested to. It just my style of thinking and how I approach them, and what I feel is the best route to take with each of those avenues kind of then changes. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. Maybe we could just speak briefly about the communities you've met and the philosophies you've seen and how those have worked or how they can be improved. Community is always a tricky one. It always gets a strong reaction from people. Yeah, what are your general thoughts on the types you've met so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think so far, I mean, the first general statement I make is that there are a lot of different types of communities out there and a lot of different possibilities within community. You know, in Madison, Wisconsin, there's a lot of, community gardens, and you see that a lot in more urban and city type situations. The thing that I saw lacking there was, you have these community garden plots, and each person gets like their own little however many square feet, and they grow this much. But I think a better way to approach it is, you have these different community garden plots throughout, a city. Even take parks, for example, that are in cities. And there's a way that we can approach it in terms of planning out those spaces as a community rather than as individuals. So rather than me and my neighbor each having our own small plot on this community space and growing separately, because, I mean, you go to these community gardens and you see people growing the same things. Why have so many people put their energy into the same thing? Whereas let's design this community space. Let's plant the things. Let's first figure out who's all in our community, what we need, what we want in terms of food, and then plan it out that way, and then share and delegate that work. And that's definitely, the kind of the permaculture approach to that situation. Same with parks. Or even in streets in urban areas, you have a lot of places where, they'll plant a variety of a fruiting tree that doesn't necessarily produce fruit, but produces a beautiful flower because they think, oh, it's a park. People want it to look beautiful. But it's, why aren't our public spaces like that? Why aren't we designing them to incorporate food as well for people? And so that's something that jumps out to me there in terms of the community aspect for cities.
And how are those organized? The person with the most experience tends to run the show, or what have you seen in terms of the decision-making process?
That's the thing, is that I really haven't seen, me personally, I haven't seen a system like that where everyone comes together and designs that community garden space and uses it together. I was more so saying that's what I would like to see. Now, I'm sure that somewhere in some city in the world that, that's going on. I've kind of been avoiding cities and that kind of style of living for a while. But yeah, I mean, that's the kind of opportunity. Same with beyond community, like actual garden plots. I mean, the ways that people are getting creative with, rooftop gardening and that type of thing offers a lot of opportunities in city environments. So that's, yeah, from a city standpoint, that's where I kind of see where community has to come in together. And then on the social side, I mean, beyond food, going into the idea of, co-housing and ride shares and this and that. And in most cities today, there's just such a disconnect between people, and that we kind of have to revitalize that idea of community just in general.
What have you seen in the communities you've been in the more rural areas, the farms, and how that's developed? Or do they tend to just simply be businesses and don't really include a whole bunch of decision-making and that kind of stuff?
No, there was definitely a few, the farms that I had mentioned that I went and worked on during the off-season that were more homesteading-style farms. I think that was definitely more so where I began experiencing, all right, this is community living. This is a group of people coming together. Same with the farm in Hawaii, Mohala Farms, that I worked for on Oahu, is probably the best example and experiences that I've had in terms of community living in a farming setting so far. So, I mean, we are, a 6-acre farm, and there's anywhere from 10 to 15 or 20 people living and working there at one time. So I mean, this is an example of a small community, but in a sense it still is a community. And within that, beyond the farm work and the business side, I mean, we have, the operating farm, and we have our certain tasks that need to get done, but, we also have our crops and that we're using to feed ourselves, and the harvesting of those and the preparation of those. So that's where, I mean, for example, how we do it is every week we have a weekly sign up of different tasks and chores that are completely separate from, what our jobs are as farm employees or farm work traders, which is kind of the business side. So talking more about the community side, it's, it's sharing tasks like things that people often overlook as being not such a big deal, but okay, who's cleaning the kitchen this week? Who's cleaning the bathroom? Who's walking and feeding the dogs? Who's, feeding the chickens and making sure you're opening their and closing their coop? And, who's cooking dinner this night? Who's cooking breakfast? And so we kind of delegate and we kind of share all of those tasks and we rotate through them. And I think it definitely does create that sense of community because, the farm, those 6 acres and all those people living together, it only functions well when everyone is kind of doing their part.
So how do you decide who decides how to rotate those tasks on a more meta level?
It's kind of, it varies from group to group. And I think that's the other, challenging thing with community is sometimes your community is a set group of people. Like a group of people come together and say, okay, we're going to live this way. And so you have the opportunity to know exactly what you're dealing with in terms of the other people that you're, doing this with. Whereas with Mohala, it's that group is constantly changing. So you constantly have different personalities, different types of people. And so you kind of have to be very good at adapting and compromising in a sense. So how we delegate those things, it definitely varies from group to group. With some groups, it's, look, we're all just going to make sure that no one's on the same task the same week, in a row. It's just always going to rotate. So everyone's, doing different. But there are definitely people that come in that are like, look, I don't know how to cook. I can't imagine cooking for 20 people. And so then it's like, all right, well, do you want to learn or do you not want to learn? And, more often than not, the people that come into that type of living situation want to learn. And so we kind of ease them into, someone that has cooked and we'll kind of share that responsibility with them. So I think the biggest thing is, having open communication in that decision-making process and allowing people to have the space to share however it is that they're feeling about any aspects of, that community living situation. We would typically always have a weekly community meeting with everyone. We'd sit down. The owner of the farm typically would just kind of do an overview of, the business and farm side of things in terms of how things were going. And then we would dive into the community aspect and we would just, openly talk about how, things that bugged us, things that we thought were working well, things that we didn't think were working well. People look at it and call it many different things. There's the Native American practice, they call it the talking stick. Each person gets to hold the stick and they get, their time to sit there and say what they want to say. And some people, will sit in a circle and it's, and they take their turn going around in a circle sharing. So it's creating that environment and space for people to be people, I guess, to openly share and not feel like they're being oppressed in any way. So I think that's figuring out within your own community the best way to approach that. And it it's different in varying communities. Like I said, you have the communities that are the same group of people that they go into it, and that's how it's going to be. You have communities that grow and open up doors for new people to join, and then you have the communities that it's, a revolving door of people that's constantly changing.
What do you prefer? Do you have any preferences?
Oh, man. Depending on what mood I'm in that day, I might give you a different answer.
Okay, yeah, people are people. We're like weather, aren't we?
Yeah. Honestly, at the end of the day, I love, a constantly changing group. As much as it challenges you, I think that challenge is also one of the best parts about it, because it makes you look at yourself a lot more often than not, because you get a new perspective on things constantly, in terms of just, the backgrounds that people come from, the knowledge that they come and share with you, the knowledge you're able to share with them. And so I think I personally really like that. Now, on the flip side, you can still have that with a group that's the same people, because, as you know, and as all of us know, like, people are, we're always evolving, we're always changing. So you can either see the change and the growth as, groups come and go, or you can see the change and growth within one group over a long span of time. And I think both are, amazing things to experience. But, me personally, I love the constant change, just because I love to learn and, experience new things, but I also love to share what I have to offer, and, and having different people coming and going provides that type of space.
Cool. So we've gone through some farming and some community, but one passion we both share, I think, is working with people in countries where people have less in general.
Yeah, definitely.
You've got a lot of experience in Sierra Leone. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about where you work there and what you do, and we'll take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, how long? A little over 2 years ago now. I got introduced to a man named Hindalo Pokawa, and he was originally from a village in rural Sierra Leone called Mondema, and it's in the Kenema district of Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is broken up into 12 different districts in the country. And he had started a nonprofit organization. He came to the States when he was younger, when he was about 20 or 21. This was in the 90s, during the Sierra Leone Civil War. He had left the country and ended up coming to the States. And so he started this nonprofit in the States after having lived here for 10 plus years. It was basically going back to his home village where he grew up. And, Sierra Leone is a country that has one of the highest infant mortality rates. The country itself does not have a single preschool or nursery school program in any of the rural villages. You have malnutrition issues, very high poverty, high birth rates, poor medical care and health environments for people. And so he started this nonprofit, and it now is also an NGO, to basically go and build Sierra Leone's first rural preschool program in his hometown village of Mondema. And at the beginning, that was pretty much the goal, and that still is the goal. We approached that project. So once I came into the project, obviously from the agricultural side of things, because they were approaching the design of the school in terms of building it, the land that it was on, from a permaculture standpoint, and using permaculture design principles. So when I had joined them, the school had already begun to be built. The site had already been kind of laid out at, 22-acre site. They had already, done the full mapping in terms of, this is where the school is going to be, this is where the gardens are going to be, this is where we're going to do, orchard and food forest, this is where, animal livestock will be raised, this is where a playground's going to be, like, long list of things. And so what started as just building this school is now we're definitely going full-blown permaculture and realizing, okay, we have a village here and it's actually a pretty large village, with probably a few thousand people that live in it. But I mean, you look at the demographic, and some crazy number, like 50% of the people in the village are between the ages of 4 and 8 years old or something like that. Yeah. And it's crazy. And so, yeah, for the last 2 years, I've been, going there, aiding in, designing, this is how we're going to do the kitchen and toilets. Like this last year, I was just there not even a month ago. I was just there through December and into January. And it was basically, figuring out how we were going to finish building the kitchen for the school and the bathrooms, and how we were going to do a biodigesting toilet system and all of this. And and in previous trips it's been, okay, here's the solar pump that we're going to put in for our water system that's going to pump water to these tanks, and it's going to gravity feed, and here's the whole irrigation piping that we put in for the garden system and all of this. And then it's, the goal has been to be able to feed the children 2 meals a day for 4 days a week while they're in school. And it's a free school, whereas in Sierra Leone, typically parents always have to pay fees to send their kids to school. And we do have a work trade program, though, that any parent that has a child in our school has to lend 10 hours of work on the farm per month. And so, yeah, the school is built, it's running, but, when you approach that community side, we're trying to approach all of those issues that I mentioned kind of earlier, whereas, okay, there's not really a birthing center or a healthy, clean environment for all of these births that are going on at a kind of rampant rate in the village. And so, getting a proper health center put into the village is on our long list of things to do, as well as, putting in a library and setting up social enterprises surrounding carpentry and welding, and rice mill and bakery and all of these things to basically help not only this preschool program that we're developing, but as well as help the village overall in terms of creating more access, education for their children, access to more clean water and food and jobs. I mean, unemployment is about 75% in the village. A lot of different challenges. And so this vision that Hindalo had of just building this preschool program is now becoming, basically restructuring a community into how can we sustain it and provide things that we almost kind of take for granted, in Europe and in the States. And that's kind of where we're at with it. And I guess from the side of, working kind of with NGOs and in this community aspect, I hate that even with farming, as we were talking earlier, I kept going back to the idea of money and sustaining yourself. And it's unfortunate that money is such a driving factor this day and age, but at the end of the day it is, and that's how you kind of make these types of projects happen. So with doing a community project like this, you kind of hit a stalemate in terms of fundraising gets to be very challenging after a certain point when you 3, 5, 10 years into a project and you've been constantly going to the same sources or constantly kind of doing the same type of fundraising events. You start noticing that the amount that people are willing to donate kind of goes down over time. And with the amount of NGOs and nonprofits that there are this day and age, grant writing is very competitive, and all of these things that make funds very typical. And I'm sure you can relate to this in a sense in terms of, putting together the project that we worked on in Nepal. So that's where there's kind of the two positives to this idea of creating social enterprises within this project is we're benefiting the village by, creating jobs for people that we can pay them and create access to, food and water and those types of things. But at the same time, it's also a revenue source for us as an organization to keep building on the momentum that we've done and keep developing the project so we can keep providing those opportunities for the people in the village.
Wow. So how's that working? How much percentage of your budget is coming now from social enterprise?
At this stage, it's definitely still a small percentage. So, I mean, our social enterprise that we do have going is we have a tailoring guild. So it's basically we, bought various sewing machines and fabrics and this and that for people to come and have a space to, make their traditional cloths and clothes and this and that to sell at markets. We did set up a women's carpentry guild. That one is more providing education. It's funny. We started noticing that our social enterprises, we have revenue making ones and kind of more service ones. So yeah, the Women's Carpentry Guild has definitely been more of a service one in terms of providing practical knowledge and hands-on opportunity for women to dive into a realm, especially in a predominantly Islamic society where it's very male dominant. And same, the health center was another one that we were like, okay, this can't be a revenue making one. This needs to be a service type social enterprise. So that's, the health center that we've been helping develop is, provided free of charge. But back to the revenue side, we did start a bakery and bought basically this kind of dough roller that they typically go to a different village to use and pay to use. That basically just allows them to roll out their dough to let it sit and then rise and throw in. So yeah, we're making fresh bread to not only feed children at the school, but then to take to the market and sell. We did buy a few different motorbikes because motorbike is the main form of, transportation and people are paying for rides to here and there. So as an organization, we own, I guess, like a fleet of motorbikes that are riding around making money. Our next one we're looking into is getting a rice mill. Because the closest rice mill is actually like 12 miles away at a different village. So all of the rice farmers in the village, are taking all of their rice, however far, walking, this distance to go do that. So we're trying to provide, the service that, yes, it'll bring us in money, but it's also helping the village and, not forcing people to walk with their harvest 12 miles down the road to a different village, whereas we'll have it right there in Mondama. So it's definitely a small percentage. I would say that as of right now, 80% is still coming from, fundraising and private donations. So we're slowly but surely working up the amount of revenue that we're able to bring in through these social enterprises. Another one we've talked about is, setting up a guest house. So as to operate as an NGO, you need to have an office in the country that you operate in. So Bo City is the closest city to Mondama, the village that we work in. So we do have an office space there. And we've considered buying a house in the city and running a guest house to bring us in additional revenue. That also would provide us the opportunity of bringing groups from Europe and the States. So for example, at the end of this upcoming May, we have a group of about 20 high school students coming from the US that are going to come check out the project. We're also going to teach them a little bit about permaculture. We're going to do a permaculture design course, and the fee that we charge them, all goes into the organization. But I mean, we're paying to go rent out rooms at a guest house for these people. For these students. So, having a space or a guest house that we own and operate ourselves provides that opportunity to increase the amount of trips like that we can offer.
Well, it sounds super exciting. I mean, how many people are involved, would you say?
I think we have about 8 board members, like active board members. And then, I mean, there's a long list of people that are supporting organizations and donors and this and that. So, I mean, as a group, in terms of the planning and deciding how funds are used and budgeting and then actually being on the ground and working, there's about 8 of us. But I mean, it's a network now that's, grown. I mean, when you look at the teachers that we trained and hired that are from the village, they're technically part of it. We have our office staff and Bo that we trained and hired that are part of the organization. And so there's, the group of us that are from the States that work and do fundraising. There's a group that we have that are from the UK that are doing this and that. So it's, it's a network of over 50 people at the end of the day, but it's really just a core group of around 8.
Wow, that sounds like a really exciting project. Do you see it going in other places, in other directions in the soon, or is it about consolidating everything that you've done and created so far?
I mean, the overall goal that we've set is to replicate this same model, with building the preschool and then doing everything around it. Our goal is to do 2 schools in each district in Sierra Leone. And, and then going from there in terms of, I know Hindalo's been approached by groups in Kenya and Nigeria, and Ghana. And so it's beyond that, it's going, to these other communities that are in just as big of a need. So I definitely see the possibility for this type of model to expand. And that's the beauty of it, is there are groups out there that necessarily aren't us that are doing similar work. And so it's a model that can be replicated and done in various environments and situations. For us personally right now, we're just trying to fine tune our initial model and completely get that one done. So then when we go into, say, the next village in Sierra Leone that we want to build another school, we kind of have everything figured out and know exactly how we want to do it.
Yeah, is this not, in some ways, when you talk about other groups and other NGOs, I definitely get the feeling that we've got a city community of gardeners that are all growing tomatoes at the same time. And I wonder how some of, once you do get a system that works, or if someone else gets a system that works, it feels unfortunate that we can't share what works in a more effective way. Or maybe that's beginning to happen.
I think it's definitely beginning to happen, and that's, I think I said this before while we were talking, but that's the exciting thing to me, is we have all of these challenges that we're facing, but that there's this underlying momentum that's going on, and people are starting to challenge the status quo and think differently and approach, education, food, water, housing, community, all of these things from a different aspect. And it's funny, and it's a lot of the ways that we're starting to view it and approach it are things that our ancestors did for however long, and we're now kind of relearning them and putting our own modern spin on them in a sense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for modern spin, isn't there? I mean, science has made us so much more efficient and effective at certain things, but it's taken away a lot of our meaning and direction in other senses. So it's a question of taking the best of both worlds and combining them. But that sounds a little bit like what this project is. I mean, looking at the basics like bread and then health and then transport, it's sort of really holistic, isn't it, as an approach?
Yeah, definitely is. And it's funny that how you said that was, so if you go to like Vitruvian Farms, I'm kind of, shifting to the farm back in Wisconsin. You go to their website and you read kind of like their motto, and they talk about how the way that they're trying to approach farming is they're not trying to reject technology, and they're not trying to reject old practices. Is they're trying to find the best way to combine the two. And that goes far beyond farming. It goes into all of those things that we just listed. And it's how can we best combine the knowledge and development that we have now with the time-tested practices of the generations before us.
If I cut myself open, take me down to the nearest Western hospital and stitch me up, But then if I want to stay healthy and well, then maybe I want more preventative, holistic medicine. So there's definitely room for both. Let's switch gears a little bit and just, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've talked about so many different areas. If you did, I guess there's 2 questions. One is if you had a whole bunch of money, and we're talking, $1 million or something, where would you invest that now in terms of socially and the projects and the approach from all the different areas you've done? Where do you think you'd see the most room for scalability and replicability and sustainability economically with an amount like that?
My first response to that wants to be, focusing on more of the humanitarian side of things and areas and communities that are almost untouched by, these ideas that we've been talking about. And that's the idea of permaculture. So I think of, being able to go into a community and not just one, and being able to, find a way to use that money to do various projects in various communities where you're creating, sustenance for the people there that is, at the end of the day, created by themselves through knowledge, through education, through, farming, through construction, through all of those things. And I guess, that's the one side of me. And then there's the other side of me that goes, all right, if I had that much, I know I kind of have an idea of my own dream farm in a sense, or a farm that I would do. And I can't necessarily pick a location off the top of my head, but, a space and a farm that incorporates various styles of agroforestry. You remember me mentioning earlier, you have things like alley cropping and silvopasture and food forests and those types of things. And seeing that all in one space together is something that is really inspiring to me, because with that, you have the opportunity. So with the small scale food forest style of things, that's where you can get into community and housing. So you have your various community members that are all living on a farm or on a piece of land, and they all have their own little food forests, or they have one, food forest that's for the community members. And then you can go out a little farther from there, and then you can have your alley cropping, which is basically combining perennial and annual farming, where you have rows of perennials or tree crops intermixed with then alleyways for annuals to be produced. And that opens up the realm for, doing growing plant-based medicines, growing different fruits and vegetables that can be turned into value-added products. And then you start, that starts increasing the amount of people that you can provide food for beyond just your own community. And that's something that I think about when I think of starting my own project is, there's yourself and your family and your community that you want to grow food for, but then there are however many other people. And so finding a balance between having that homesteading farm, that small scale organic farm, and that larger scale farm is something that interests me, in trying to figure out what the feasibility of that is.
Wow. So how many people would you support, do you think, on, let's say, a per acre basis?
That's a tough question to answer, because depending on how you design that acre, I mean, a family of say 3 to 5 people, you can grow enough food on a quarter of an acre to support that family if you design it correctly. So, if you start doing the math and scaling that up, you can, that the number of people that you can feed with land is pretty impressive. But when you think of our existing situations already in terms of neighborhoods and lawns that people have, and if, those lawns started to be converted into, spaces to grow food, and same with, as we were talking earlier, with community garden spaces in cities and parks and those types of things, the land is there. And the space is there for us to start sustaining ourselves, rather than having these big, huge farms far away that are producing mass amounts of, food that, is sprayed with whatever type of chemical that's hurting the soil in this way and that way, and then is shipped, however many thousands of miles to then feed people. Whereas the space and opportunity to provide that for ourselves is, right in your backyard sometimes.
Totally. I mean, the two things spring to mind is the idea of using supermarket roofs. I've always thought would be great to have food just coming downstairs. And the other thing, in England, there's a great movement of guerrilla gardeners that take, roundabouts and things like that and garden inside them illegally, but they just take land that's not being used and produce on it.
Yeah, there's even I don't know if you remember me mentioning earlier how in some cities they plant specific varieties of fruit trees just for their flower and don't actually produce fruit. There are groups that are called guerrilla grafters. So if you're familiar with the idea of grafting trees, which is basically you have a rootstock of a tree and you take a cutting from a fruiting tree and you graft it on to that rootstock. Then eventually that tree or that branch will grow and produce that fruit from the cutting. And so you have guerrilla grafters that are taking cuttings from more fruit-bearing varieties of the same type of tree, and they're going and grafting it onto all of these public space trees that used to never produce fruit.
Wow.
So you have things like that popping up. And
where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I think I still see myself trying to learn as much as possible. I don't know if you remember this conversation that we had while we were in Nepal, but I brought up how I really want to learn how to grow food in as many environments as possible, whether that's a country on each continent or this or that. So I think in the next 5 years, I still see myself, working with various projects in different parts of the world and still trying to learn and experience as much as possible before I start necessarily going off and starting my own projects, whether that's humanitarian or, my own business or this or that.
I'd love to work with you, or at least see you work at some point soon. I'm definitely always on the lookout for new building projects, and I can't wait till those building projects start to really marry with reforestation and food growing. So hopefully that will happen.
That's the dream that I hope to see happen as well. So especially with Earthships, that's what I keep hoping to see. So is the combination of, they're rocking the natural building side of things and renewable energy, and I think that next step is just that community side and that food production side. So I'm excited to see what happens with that over the next 5 years, and who knows, maybe it's something that we put together. Or
yeah,
not.
It could be. I mean, I would love to work with you again. Absolutely. This project, this little mini project of a podcast is about trying to create an interested group of people that are in touch and can be ready to jump as soon as funds or places have been found. Maybe there'll be time for a round two at some point, because I feel like we scratched the surface on a few things. It'd be interesting to get more practical. But Dan, I just have to say thank you again for the conversation, and we'll be in touch for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me, and always open to explore more specific topics in general, or with you, and kind of get down to whatever it is people are interested in or you're interested in learning more about.
Yeah, how can people get in touch with you if they have any questions for you or are interested in learning from any of the projects you're involved in?
With the amount that I'm traveling, I would say that the easiest way is definitely through email or through social media. So only social media account I have would be Facebook. You can find me under my name, Daniel Schmidt, Daniel, and then Schmidt, Schmidt. Email is probably the best other route. My email address is dano.schmidt.13@gmail.com. So that's DANO.SCHMIDT.13@gmail.com.
Cool. Well, thanks, Dan, and take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Before you go, or rather immediately after you've gone, please go down to iTunes, leave a review, help us grow, get more guests, raise more money for projects. We have other projects coming up. You can find news about those on offgrid.vision, where you can also get access to other shows and some phenomenal t-shirts which go towards, well, the profit of which goes towards new projects. If you have any requests for someone to come on the show, do let me know via the site. Until next time, thanks for listening and see you soon.